Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can save more than one life. In a moment when hope seems lost, compassion can change everything. In a small frontier town, young Eliza sees a cowboy standing on a bridge, ready to end it all. Without thinking, she pulls him back from the brink. The weathered man says nothing, but his eyes tell a story of pain. What Eliza doesn't know is that this broken cowboy was once a wealthy cattle baron who lost everything. His fortune, his land, his legacy, all gone through bad investments. Now he's a drifter with nothing left. But sometimes people with the least have the most to offer. What happens next will prove that the poorest hearts often hold the richest compassion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Millhaven sat like a weathered prayer book in the palm of the prairie, its pages yellowed by dust and time. Most folks passing through saw nothing more than another dying settlement clinging to the railroad tracks. But Eliza Washington knew better. She had learned that beneath the cracked facades and sagging porches lived stories worth telling, hearts worth knowing. At 19, Eliza possessed the kind of quiet wisdom that came from watching her mother stretch a single chicken into 3 meals and her father mend harnesses by candlelight well past midnight. The Washington family had arrived in Millhaven 5 years earlier, following the railroad construction crews westward, chasing the promise of steady work and a chance to build something lasting. Her father, Samuel, had found employment at the grain elevator, his strong hands and gentle manner earning respect even among men who had never worked alongside a black man before. Their small house on the east edge of town stood modest but proud, its whitewashed boards gleaming like hope against the endless brown of the prairie. Eliza's mother, Ruth, had planted a garden that seemed to defy the harsh climate, coaxing tomatoes and beans from soil that claimed to grow nothing but wheat and sorrow. Neighbors had learned to pause at the Washington fence, drawn by the scent of Ruth's cornbread and the sound of Eliza's voice drifting through the evening air as she read aloud from whatever book the traveling preacher had left behind. The wooden bridge that spanned Willow Creek represented the dividing line in more ways than geography. On the west side stood the established families, the Hendersons who owned the general store, the Millers who ran the grain elevator, the Prescotts whose cattle grazed the richest bottomland. On the east side lived the railroad workers, the seasonal hands, the families like the Washingtons who had arrived with hope in their hearts and determination in their souls. That October morning, with autumn painting the cottonwoods in shades of amber and rust, Eliza had crossed the bridge on her way to Henderson's store. Mrs. Henderson had sent word that a new shipment of fabric had arrived, and Eliza possessed the finest needlework skills in 3 counties. The arrangement suited both women perfectly. Eliza earned enough to contribute to her family's income, and Mrs. Henderson's customers received the quality stitching that kept them returning. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter, and Eliza pulled her woolen shawl closer as she walked. Her mother had knitted it from yarn, unraveled from Samuel's old sweaters. The deep blue color faded, but still beautiful in the early light. She hummed softly as she walked, a spiritual her grandmother had sung while working in gardens much farther south, in places where the soil held different memories. The bridge beneath her feet showed its age in the way of all things built quickly, to serve immediate needs. The railroad company had constructed it to last long enough for the tracks to be laid and the initial settlements to take hold. No one had planned for permanence, yet here it stood 15 years later, weathered but sturdy, bearing the weight of dreams and daily necessity. It was then she saw him. The cowboy stood at the far end of the bridge, his hands gripping the rough wooden railing with a desperation that made her heart catch. Even from a distance, she could see the slump of defeat in his shoulders, the way a man holds himself when the fight has left him entirely. His hat, once fine but now battered by weather, and wear cast shadows across a face she had never seen in town before. Everything about him spoke of endings. The way his boots were planted wide, as if preparing for a final act. The stillness of his body, like a man who had made peace with terrible decisions. Most telling of all was the absolute silence that surrounded him. No humming, no whistling, no sounds of someone engaged with the world of the living. Eliza had seen grief before. She had watched her grandfather fade after her grandmother passed, seen neighbors lose children to fever, witnessed the hollow expressions of men who returned from failed ventures with empty wagons and emptier pockets, but this felt different. This carried the weight of something beyond ordinary sorrow. Her steps slowed as she drew closer, and she found herself studying details with the careful attention her mother had taught her. The cowboy's clothes, though dusty and travel-worn, had been expensive once. The cut of his coat spoke of custom tailoring, and his boots, despite their scuffed condition, bore the hallmarks of fine craftsmanship. A silver watch chain caught the morning light, and his hat, for all its weathering, had been shaped by skilled hands. Most intriguingly, his horse, a magnificent bay stallion, stood ground-tied nearby, its quality unmistakable even to Eliza's untrained eye. The animal's breeding showed in every line, from its proud neck to its powerful hindquarters. The saddle, too, represented significant investment, its leather tooled with intricate patterns that spoke of Mexican craftsmanship at its finest. Yet, for all the evidence of wealth, the man himself radiated the particular emptiness that comes when material possessions lose their power to provide comfort or meaning. Eliza had witnessed this contradiction before, in the traveling merchants who passed through town with fine goods but hollow eyes, men who had learned that owning beautiful things could not fill the spaces where love and purpose should dwell. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of mist from the creek below. The water moved slowly, barely 2 feet deep even at its center, but deep enough for a man determined to escape his troubles. The rocky bottom would provide no soft landing, no gentle embrace for someone who had given up on tomorrow. Eliza's mind raced through possibilities. She could retreat, pretend she had seen nothing, allow whatever was meant to happen to unfold without her involvement. The safe choice, the expected choice, would be to turn back toward home and let this stranger's story end as he had planned. After all, what business was it of hers? What right did she have to interfere in the desperate calculations of a man she had never met? But her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, words spoken over countless evening meals and bedtime prayers. "Child, when the Lord puts someone in your path, especially someone hurting, you don't get to choose whether it's convenient. You just get to choose whether you're going to answer the call." The wooden planks creaked softly under her feet as she continued forward, each step carrying her deeper into a story she didn't fully understand, but somehow knew she was meant to. Enter. The cowboy hadn't noticed her approach, lost as he was in whatever private hell had brought him to this moment of decision. Eliza Washington, daughter of Samuel and Ruth, keeper of her grandmother's wisdom, finder of hope in hard soil, she squared her shoulders and prepared to step into the unknown. Behind her lay the familiar world of morning chores and expected routines. Ahead waited the eternal mystery of two human hearts, meeting at the intersection of despair and possibility. The morning held its breath, and Eliza stepped forward to change the course of two lives forever. "Don't!" The word escaped Eliza's lips before conscious thought could stop it, cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through fabric. The cowboy's head turned slowly, as if emerging from deep underwater, his eyes focusing on her with the bewildered expression of someone interrupted in the middle of prayer. "Don't!" she repeated, stepping closer despite every instinct urging caution. "Whatever brought you here, whatever's eating at your soul, it's not worth this." He stared at her for a long moment, taking in her brown face, her simple dress, her hands clasped tight in front of her chest. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough texture of disuse. words scraped raw by whatever internal storm had driven him to this bridge. "You don't understand, miss. You can't understand." His grip tightened on the railing, knuckles white against the weathered wood. "Sometimes a man reaches the end of what he can bear." "Maybe not," Eliza admitted, moving another step closer. "But I understand that permanent decisions made in temporary pain have a way of stealing tomorrow's possibilities." The cowboy's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who had examined hope from every angle and found it wanting. "Tomorrow's possibilities. You speak like someone who still believes in such things." "I have to. Without tomorrow, today loses all its meaning." Something flickered across his weathered features. Surprise, perhaps, at hearing philosophy from a young woman whose appearance marked her as someone society rarely expected to possess wisdom. He studied her more carefully, noting the intelligent set of her eyes, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the circumstances. "What's your name?" he asked, the question seeming to surprise them both. "Eliza Washington." "And yours?" A pause stretched between them, filled with the sound of water moving over stones and wind stirring the cottonwood leaves. "Thomas," he said finally. "Thomas Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Eliza, but she filed it away like her mother stored seeds, carefully, with attention to future planting. "Well, Thomas Whitmore, I'm going to ask you to step back from that railing and talk with me for a few minutes. Not because I have any right to ask, but because something in my heart says this morning isn't meant to end the way you planned." "Your heart." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Hearts lie, Miss Washington. They promise things they can't deliver. Lead you to trust people who don't deserve it. Convince you that tomorrow will somehow be different from today. Hearts are the cruelest liars of all, maybe, but they're also the only thing that makes the truth worth living with." The simple profundity of her words seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He released his grip on the railing, not stepping back, but no longer holding on with the desperate intensity of moments before. "You're young to be speaking of truth and lies. Age doesn't measure wisdom, Mr. Whitmore. My grandmother used to say that some folks learn more in 20 years than others do in 60. It depends on how much attention you pay to what life's trying to teach you." "And what has life taught you about men like me?" Eliza considered this carefully, studying his face, his posture, the fine quality of his travel-worn clothes. "That sometimes the richest men are the poorest, and the poorest men are the richest. That losing everything teaches you what everything was really worth. And that most folks standing on bridges aren't really trying to end their lives. They're trying to end their pain." The accuracy of her observation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stumbled backward from the railing, his hand pressed to his chest, as if trying to hold something inside that threatened to spill out. "How could you possibly?" "Because pain has a look, Mr. Whitmore. A way of changing how a person stands, how they hold their shoulders, how they breathe. I've seen it in my father after 14-hour days at the grain elevator. I've seen it in my mother when she thought nobody was watching, and the weight of keeping our family together pressed down on her like stones. Pain doesn't care about the color of your skin or the balance in your bank account. It finds everyone, eventually." Thomas sank down onto the bridge planking, his legs no longer able to support the weight of revelation and exhaustion combined. "I lost everything," he whispered, the words torn from some deep place he had tried to seal off. "Not just money, though that's gone too. I lost my purpose, my belief in my own judgment, my faith in tomorrow being any different from today." Eliza settled beside him on the weathered boards, maintaining a respectful distance while making it clear she wasn't going anywhere. "Tell me." "I owned the largest cattle operation in 3 states, Thomas continued, the words coming easier now, as if a dam had broken inside him. The Whitmore Ranch stretched from the Brazos River to the Colorado, 30,000 head of prime beef cattle, a house that took 15 minutes to walk from one end to the other. I thought I was building something that would last forever, a legacy that would carry the family name long after I was gone. He paused, staring down at the slow-moving water below. I got greedy. Saw opportunities in railroad investments, mining operations, land speculation. Borrowed against the ranch to fund ventures I didn't understand. Trusted men who saw me coming from 100 miles away. Within 3 years, it was all gone. The cattle, the land, the house, everything sold to pay debts I couldn't even explain. To myself. Where's your family now? Gone. My wife couldn't bear the shame of losing everything, packed up and returned to her family in St. Louis. Took our daughter with her. And can't say I blame her. What kind of future could I offer them? What kind of man loses 30 years of building in 3 years of foolishness? The pain in his voice made Eliza's heart ache. She had known poverty all her life, but she had never known the particular agony of falling from great height, of losing not just material possessions, but the identity that came with them. You're still a man, Mr. Whitmore. Maybe not the same man you were before, but still a man. Still someone who can choose what comes next? Choose, Thomas laughed bitterly. What choices do I have? I'm 53 years old with nothing to my name but this horse and the clothes on my back. No skills except ranching, no connections willing to risk helping a man who proved himself such a spectacular failure. I'm not just broke, Miss Washington. I'm broken. Broke can be fixed. Broken can heal. You say that like someone who's never been tested. I say that like someone who's watched her parents build something beautiful from nothing, watched neighbors help neighbors through hard times, watched communities come together when individual strength wasn't enough. I say that like someone who believes that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank balance or their success story, but by how they treat other people when they have every excuse to stop caring. Thomas studied her face, searching for some sign of insincerity, some evidence that her words were nothing more than empty comfort. Instead, he found the steady gaze of someone who had looked directly at life's difficulties and chosen hope anyway. Why? He asked simply. Why did you stop me? Why do you care what happens to a stranger who's made such a mess of everything? Eliza was quiet for a moment, watching the play of sunlight on the creek water, gathering her thoughts like her mother gathered herbs, carefully, with attention to their proper use. Because every person is carrying something heavy, Mr. Whitmore. Most of us are just better at hiding it. And because I believe that sometimes God puts people in each other's path, not by accident, but because they have something to offer each other, even when they can't see what that might be. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirt, and extended her hand toward him. Come with me. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Thomas looked at the offered hand, then up at her face, seeing something there that he had almost forgotten existed. Uncomplicated human kindness. After a moment that felt like stepping across a vast canyon, he reached out and took her hand, allowing her to help him to his feet. The bridge that had seemed like an ending became, in that moment, a beginning. The Washington house stood exactly as Eliza had left it that morning, but everything felt different now. Walking alongside Thomas Whitmore, leading his magnificent horse by the reins, she saw her home through new eyes. The careful way her mother had arranged the morning glory vines to hide the places where the porch railing had split, the prideful angle at which her father had hung his work clothes to dry, the small wooden sign he had carved to mark their address in neat, careful letters. "Ma," Eliza called as they approached the front steps. "We have company." Ruth Washington appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a woman accustomed to unexpected visitors. Her gaze moved from her daughter's face to the tall stranger beside her, noting details with practiced efficiency, the quality of his clothes despite their wear, the gentle way he handled his horse, the particular emptiness in his eyes that spoke of recent loss. "Mama, this is Mr. Thomas Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, my mother, Ruth Washington." Thomas removed his hat, the gesture automatic despite his emotional exhaustion. "Ma'am, I apologize for imposing on your morning. Your daughter—" He paused, struggling to find words that could explain the last hour. "She showed me a kindness. I didn't deserve. Ruth's expression softened at the formal courtesy in his voice, the respectful way he stood, despite whatever troubles had brought him to their door. Any friend of Eliza's is welcome here, Mr. Whitmore. You look like you could use some coffee and a place to sit for a spell. That's very generous, Mrs. Washington, but I wouldn't want to be a burden. Nonsense. Ruth stepped back from the door, her decision made. Samuel always says that burdens are just opportunities wearing work clothes. Come on inside, both of you. The interior of the Washington home reflected the same careful attention to dignity that marked its exterior. The furniture had been built by Samuel's own hands from wood salvaged and traded, each piece sanded smooth and finished with the patience of a man who understood that quality took time. Ruth's quilts provided spots of color against the plain. Walls and the scent of fresh bread filled the small rooms with warmth that had nothing to do with the cast-iron stove. Thomas settled into the chair Ruth indicated, his large frame seeming almost too substantial for the modest space. Eliza moved with easy familiarity, gathering cups and plates, while her mother disappeared into the kitchen to fetch coffee and whatever breakfast remained from the morning meal. Your daughter saved my life today, Thomas said quietly when Ruth returned, his voice carrying the weight of confession. Not just from immediate danger, but from giving up entirely. I'm not sure I can ever repay that debt. Eliza has always had a gift for seeing what others miss, Ruth replied, setting a steaming cup before him. Even as a little girl, she'd bring home-hurt animals, lost children, anyone who looked like they needed somebody to care. Samuel used to joke that our house had a sign only troubled souls could read. Maybe it does, Thomas murmured, accepting the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The warmth of the cup seemed to anchor him to the present moment, pulling him back from the edge of whatever darkness had consumed him on the bridge. Eliza studied his face as he sipped the coffee, noting the way some of the tension left his shoulders, how his breathing gradually steadied. Mr. Whitmore was just telling me about losing his ranch, she said carefully. Everything he'd built over 30 years, gone because of bad investments. Ruth's expression grew thoughtful. She had known poverty all her life, but she had also known the security of never having much to lose. The particular agony of falling from comfort to destitution was something she could imagine, but had never experienced. That must be a heavy load to carry. The heaviest part isn't the loss of things, Thomas said, surprising himself with the admission. It's the loss of who I thought I was. For 3 decades I was Thomas Whitmore, cattle baron, owner of the largest spread in Texas, a man other men respected, whose opinion mattered, whose word was good as gold. Now I'm just, he gestured, helplessly. Nobody, nothing. You're not nothing, Eliza said firmly. You're someone who built something magnificent once, which means you have the knowledge to do it again. You're someone who treated his horse well enough that the animal trusts. You're someone with enough courtesy to remove your hat in a lady's presence and enough sense to accept help when it's offered. Pretty words, Miss Washington, but they don't change reality. I'm 53 years old with no money, no prospects, and no reason for anyone to take a chance on me. The sound of boots on the porch steps interrupted the conversation. Samuel Washington's voice carried through the door as he called to his wife. Ruth, whose horse is that tied up outside? Prettiest animal I've seen in a decade. Come meet the horse's owner, Ruth called back, moving toward the door. Samuel entered with the easy stride of a man, comfortable in his own skin, his work clothes clean but showing the honest wear that came from daily labor. His eyes found Thomas. Immediately, taking in the stranger's presence with the measured caution of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. Samuel Washington, he said, extending his hand, welcome to our home. Thomas Whitmore, your family has been more than kind to a complete stranger. Eliza has a way of finding people who need finding, Samuel replied, settling into his own chair. What brings you to Millhaven, Mr. Whitmore? The question hung in the air, like dust motes in sunlight, and Thomas found himself facing the same crossroads that had brought him to the bridge. the choice between honest vulnerability and protective deception. Eliza's steady gaze encouraged truth, while her parents waited with the patient attention of people accustomed to listening to others' troubles. "I was traveling through," Thomas said slowly, "though I'll admit I had no particular destination in mind. Lost my ranch in Texas, lost pretty much everything else along with it. Been riding north, figuring each town might be the one where I stopped running from what I'd become." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Lots of men come through Millhaven running from something. Most of them keep running. What made you consider stopping here?" Thomas glanced at Eliza, remembering the moment she had pulled him back from the railing, the gentle authority in her voice when she spoke about tomorrow's possibilities. "Your daughter, sir. She convinced me that permanent decisions made in temporary pain might not be the wisest course." "Eliza said that?" Samuel looked at his daughter with the particular pride that comes from recognizing one's child has inherited the family's best qualities. Sounds like something her grandmother would have said. That woman had a way with words that could stop a stampede or start a revolution, depending on what the situation called for. "I can see where the gift comes from," Thomas replied. And for the first time since entering their home, something approaching a smile touched the corners of his mouth. Ruth refilled his coffee cup, her movements carrying the comfortable efficiency of a woman who had spent decades making strangers feel welcome. "The question now, Mr. Whitmore, is what you plan to do next. Winter's coming, and a man needs more than good intentions to survive the prairie cold." The practical concern in her voice touched something in Thomas that had been dormant for months, the basic human need to be seen as worth worrying about, worth planning for. "I honestly don't know, Mrs. Washington. I've been taking things one day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time." "Well," Samuel said, rising from his chair, "one day at a time is how all good work gets done. If you're willing, there's plenty that needs doing around here, and I could use an extra pair of hands. Won't pay much, but it includes meals and a place to sleep." Thomas stared at him, unable to process the unexpected offer. "Mr. Washington, you don't know anything about me. For all you know, I could be running from the law, or could be," Samuel agreed. "But my daughter's judgment is usually sound, and a man who treats his horse that well and remembers his manners in a lady's presence probably isn't the dangerous sort. Besides, everyone deserves a chance to prove who they really are when the chips are down." The simple generosity of the offer overwhelmed Thomas completely. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup, feeling something he had thought permanently lost stirring back to life in his chest. Hope. The barn behind the Washington house had seen better decades, but Thomas recognized good bones beneath the weathered exterior. Samuel led him through the small structure, pointing out the stall where Thomas's horse could shelter, the corner where hay bales were stacked against the coming winter, the workbench where harnesses were mended and tools sharpened. "It's not much," Samuel said, gesturing toward the small room at the back of the barn, "but it's dry and warm. Eliza helped me fix the roof last spring, so you won't wake up with snow on your blanket." Thomas stepped into the modest space, taking in the single window that faced east toward the sunrise, the narrow bed with its clean but simple bedding, the small table and chair that completed the furnishings. After weeks of sleeping under stars and waking to uncertainty, the humble room felt like luxury beyond measure. "Mr. Washington, I don't know how to thank you for this kindness. I promise you won't regret." "Thomas." Samuel's voice carried the firm gentleness that comes from years of leadership without authority. "A man's word is measured by his actions, not his promises. Show me who you are through what you do, and we'll get along fine." Over the following days, Thomas threw himself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove his worth. He repaired the loose boards on the chicken coop, reinforced the fence around Ruth's vegetable garden, and spent hours helping Samuel maintain the equipment at the grain elevator. His hands, soft from months of idle travel, quickly roughened. Again, blisters forming and hardening into the calluses that marked a man willing to earn his keep. But it was the evenings that revealed the true complexity of his situation. Sitting around the Washington family table, sharing simple meals prepared with care and conversation seasoned with genuine interest, Thomas felt the particular disorientation of someone discovering that happiness could exist in circumstances he had never considered adequate. "Tell us about your ranch," Ruth said one evening, as they lingered over coffee and the last slice of her apple pie. "What was it like running such a large operation?" Thomas set down his cup carefully, gathering memories that still carried sharp edges. "At its peak, we employed nearly 40 men year-round. During roundup season, that number doubled. I knew every acre of the land, every stream and waterhole, every place where the grass grew thickest. It wasn't just a business. It was a living thing, something that breathed and grew and demanded everything I could give it." "What happened?" Eliza asked gently. "How did the investments go wrong?" "Pride," Thomas said simply. "I thought success in ranching meant I understood all business. When railroad men came with talk of expansion opportunities, mining operations that couldn't fail, land deals that would double my holdings overnight, I listened with my ego instead of my common sense. Borrowed against land that had been in my family for generations to chase dreams that existed only on paper." Samuel nodded slowly. "Easy to judge a man's decisions when you weren't standing in his boots at the time. What matters is what you learned from the experience. I learned that 30 years of careful building can disappear in 30 months of foolish choices. I learned that men who seem like friends when you have money become strangers when you need help. Most of all, I learned that losing everything you thought defined you teaches you who you really are underneath all the possessions and positions." "And who are you underneath?" Eliza asked, her question carrying the weight of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Thomas considered this carefully, aware that his answer mattered more than social politeness required. "I'm still figuring that out, Miss Washington. For so long, I was what I owned, what I controlled, what other people said about me. Now I have to discover who I am when none of those things exist." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door, sharp and authoritative in a way that made everyone pause. Samuel rose to answer it, returning moments later with Sheriff Clayton Reeves, whose expression suggested this was not a social call. "Evening, folks," Sheriff Reeves said, his eyes moving immediately to Thomas. "Sorry to interrupt your meal, but I need to speak with your guest here." Thomas stood slowly, his face carefully composed despite the anxiety that twisted in his stomach. "Sheriff, is there a problem? Got a telegram from Marshal Davidson down in San Antonio. Says he's been tracking a man named Thomas Whitmore, wanted in connection with some financial irregularities, bank fraud specifically. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Thomas felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on him, measuring his response, and realized that whatever he said next would determine not just his immediate fate, but whether the fragile trust he had been building with this family could survive the truth. "There was no fraud, Sheriff," Thomas said quietly. "The loans I took were all legitimate, documented and witnessed. When the investments failed, I lost everything, but I didn't steal anything. The marshals probably responding to complaints from creditors who lost money when I couldn't repay what I owed." "So you admit you're Thomas Whitmore of the Whitmore Ranch?" "I am. Or was, rather, since the ranch no longer exists." Sheriff Reeves studied him carefully, noting the steady way Thomas met his gaze, the absence of the nervous energy that usually marked guilty men. "Marshal Davidson wants to talk with you. Says there are questions about where some of the borrowed money went, whether all the assets were properly disclosed during the bankruptcy proceedings." "I'll answer any questions the marshal has," Thomas replied. "I've got nothing to hide. Poor judgment isn't a crime, though it probably should be." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll need you to come to town with me tomorrow morning. Telegraph the marshal that I've located you. Arrange for him to come up from San Antonio." After Sheriff Reeves departed, the kitchen felt smaller, filled with the weight of unspoken questions and uncertain loyalties. Thomas sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. "I should leave," he said quietly. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door. You've been nothing but kind to me, and this is how I repay you." "Sit down, Thomas," Samuel said firmly. "Running away now would make you look guilty whether you are or not. Besides, a man faces his troubles head-on, with friends standing beside him if he's fortunate enough to have them. You still want me here, even knowing that I might be a criminal?" Eliza reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Mr. Whitmore, I've spent my whole life learning to judge people by their character, not their circumstances. In the weeks you've been here, you've shown yourself to be honest, hard-working, and grateful for kindness. If Marshal Davidson has questions, we'll help you answer them. If he has accusations, we'll help you defend against them." Ruth nodded her agreement. "This family doesn't abandon people when trouble comes calling. That's when they need friends the most." Thomas stared at them, overwhelmed by loyalty he had done nothing to deserve, support offered without conditions or reservations. For the second time since arriving in Millhaven, he felt something shift inside him. Not hope this time, but something even more powerful. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he belonged somewhere, to someone, in a way that had nothing to do with money or status or the opinions of strangers. "Thank you," he whispered, the words inadequate for the gratitude that filled his chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for seeing something in me worth defending." Marshal Davidson arrived on the noon train, a compact man with steel-gray hair and the methodical manner of someone accustomed to dealing with financial crimes. His questions were sharp and thorough, delivered in the sheriff's office while Thomas sat across from him, acutely aware that his freedom might depend on how convincingly he could explain decisions that seemed foolish even to him. "According to the records from Austin," Marshal Davidson said, consulting a folder thick with papers, "you borrowed against your ranch to the tune of $200,000 between January 1872 and September 1874. That's a considerable sum, Mr. Whitmore." "Yes, sir. I borrowed heavily to invest in what I believed were sound opportunities: railroad expansion, mining operations, land speculation in growing territories. The problem is that some of your creditors claim you misrepresented the value of your assets. They say your ranch was worth significantly less than the collateral you offered." Thomas straightened in his chair, his voice gaining strength. "Marshal, I owned that land for 30 years. I knew every acre, every head of cattle, every improvement. The valuations I provided were based on comparable sales and my own knowledge of what the property could produce. If they proved optimistic, that was a matter of poor judgment, not deliberate deception. What about the mining investments in Colorado? 7 creditors lost substantial sums when those ventures failed. I lost more than any of them," Thomas replied. "I put my own money in first, risked everything I had on the assurance of men who claimed to understand geology and mineral rights. When the ore deposits proved worthless, I was as surprised and devastated as anyone." The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Thomas's financial dealings, every investment decision, every loan agreement. Marshal Davidson was thorough but not unkind, and Thomas began to sense that the man was looking for evidence of criminal intent, rather than assuming it existed. "One final question, Mr. Whitmore. Several witnesses claim you lived extravagantly during the period when you were accumulating debt. Expensive parties, costly improvements to your house, purchases that seemed inconsistent with your growing financial difficulties." Thomas closed his eyes, remembering the dinner parties in the grand dining room, the imported furniture, the thoroughbred horses his wife had insisted on buying. "Marshal, I was trying to maintain appearances while I waited for my investments to pay off. I believed, foolishly as it turned out, that success was just around the corner, that one good quarter would solve all my problems. I spent money I didn't have because I convinced myself I would have it soon. In other words, you lived a lie. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, but he forced himself to meet the marshal's gaze. Yes, sir, I lived a lie. I lied to my wife, my friends, my creditors, and most of all to myself. But I didn't commit fraud. I made terrible decisions based on wishful thinking and pride. But I never intentionally deceived anyone about the nature of my assets or investments. Marshal. Davidson closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. Mr. Whitmore, I've investigated dozens of cases like yours. Men who started with good intentions and ended up in financial ruin. The difference between honest failure and criminal fraud usually comes down to intent and honesty. From what I can determine, you were honest about your assets, even if you were overly optimistic about their value. And your intent seems to have been genuine, even if your judgment was poor. Thomas felt his heart begin to beat normally for the first time in hours. What does that mean, Marshal? It means I'm not going to arrest you. Your creditors have every right to pursue civil remedies, but I don't see evidence of criminal wrongdoing. You're free to go, Mr. Whitmore, though I'd suggest you think carefully about any future business ventures. The relief that flooded through Thomas was so intense it left him dizzy. He stood unsteadily, shaking the marshal's hand with gratitude he couldn't adequately express. Thank you, sir. I know you were just doing your job, but thank you for doing it fairly. Outside the sheriff's office, Thomas found Samuel waiting with the wagon, his presence a quiet testimony to loyalty that transcended social boundaries. How did it go? Samuel asked as Thomas climbed onto the seat beside him. No charges. The marshal concluded that I was foolish, but not criminal. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the weight of months of uncertainty lifting from his shoulders. Samuel, I can't thank you enough for standing by me. Another man might have suggested I move on rather than bring potential trouble to his family. Another man might not have seen what we see in you, Samuel replied, guiding the horses toward home. Ruth always says that character shows itself most clearly when a person's back is against the wall. You've been nothing but honest about your situation, hard-working in your efforts to contribute, and respectful in your dealings with our family. That tells us who you really are. As they drove through the familiar streets of Millhaven, Thomas felt something settling inside him, a sense of place and belonging that he had never experienced, even during the height of his prosperity. The grand house in Texas had been a monument to his success, but it had never felt like home, in the way the modest Washington property did now. Samuel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. Always do. Do you think there's a future for someone like me in a town like this? Not the man I was before, but the man I am now. 53 years old, no money, no prospects beyond the work of my hands? Samuel considered the question carefully, his weathered hands steady on the reins. Thomas, I've lived in Millhaven for 5 years now, and I've learned something important about small towns. They don't care much about where you came from or what you lost along the way. What they care about is whether you're willing to contribute to the community, whether you can be counted on when times get hard, whether you treat people with respect, regardless of their station in life. And you think I can do those things. I think you're already doing them. The question is whether you can see yourself building a different kind of life here, one that doesn't depend on getting back what you lost. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, watching the familiar landmarks pass by. The grain elevator where he worked alongside Samuel, the general store where Mrs. Henderson had begun nodding politely when he passed, the bridge where Eliza had saved his life, and, in doing so, changed its entire direction. You know what's strange? Thomas said finally. For 30 years, I measured success by how much I could accumulate, how much I could control, how impressive I could make my life appear to others. I thought happiness was something you achieved by reaching certain benchmarks, acquiring certain possessions. And now I'm living in a barn room, behind a house that could fit in my old kitchen, working for wages that wouldn't have covered my monthly expenses back then, and I wake up every morning feeling more content than I have in years. I don't understand it, but I'm grateful for it." Samuel smiled, the first time Thomas had seen him display open pleasure rather than measured kindness. "That's not strange at all, Thomas. That's what happens when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to serve them instead. When you stop measuring your worth by what you own and start measuring it by what you contribute." As they turned into the familiar yard, Thomas saw Eliza hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her movements economical and graceful, her voice carrying fragments of a song her grandmother had taught her. She looked up as the wagon approached, and the relief that crossed her face when she saw him told Thomas everything he needed to know about how much his fate had mattered to her. "Welcome home," Samuel said quietly, and Thomas realized with surprise that the words felt completely accurate. For the first time since losing everything, he was truly home. Winter arrived in Millhaven like an old friend who stayed longer than welcome, settling over the prairie with the quiet persistence that marked all significant changes. Thomas had never experienced cold quite like this. Not the sharp bite of Texas blue northers that came fast and fierce, but the steady, bone-deep chill that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and unforgiving. He found himself grateful for the routine that had developed over the months since Marshal Davidson's visit. Each morning began before dawn, feeding the animals and checking the equipment at the grain elevator alongside Samuel. The work had changed him physically. His hands were permanently stained now with the honest dirt of daily labor, and his shoulders had broadened from lifting and carrying. But the changes went deeper than muscle and callus. "You're thinking too hard again," Eliza observed one evening, as they sat by the fireplace, she with her mending basket and he with one of her father's books. The Washington family had discovered his hunger for reading and gradually shared their small but carefully chosen library. Tonight, he held a volume of Ralph Waldo Emerson, though his attention kept drifting from the page to the young woman across from him. "Just wondering about choices," Thomas said, closing the book and giving her his full attention. "Whether we make them or they make us," meaning 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a kitchen in Kansas, reading philosophy by firelight and feeling more at peace than I had in years, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life entirely. Eliza's needle paused in its steady rhythm. "Do you miss it? The ranch, the life you had before?" Thomas considered the question with the careful honesty he had learned was both expected and valued in this household. "I miss the sense of purpose that came with building something lasting. I miss the satisfaction of watching cattle thrive under my care, of knowing every corner of land that belonged to me. But I don't miss the constant worry about markets and whether this year would be the one that finally broke me financially. What about your family, your wife and daughter?" The mention of his lost family brought a familiar ache to his chest, though time had softened its edges. "I wrote to Margaret last month, told her where I was, what I was doing. She wrote back, first letter I'd received from her since she left. Said she was glad I'd found honest work and people who cared about me, but that she couldn't see herself ever living simply again. She's filed for divorce." "I'm sorry, that must have been painful to read." "It was," Thomas admitted, "but also honest, which I appreciated. Margaret married Thomas Whitmore, the cattle baron, not Thomas Whitmore, the grain elevator worker. I can't blame her for not wanting to reinvent herself at 50 to match who I've become." "What about your daughter?" Thomas's expression grew wistful. "Sarah's 24 now, married to a banker in St. Louis. Margaret says she's expecting her first child in the spring. I probably won't ever meet my grandchild, which breaks my heart, but I understand. What could I offer them? What kind of grandfather would I be with nothing to give but stories about failure?" Eliza set down her mending and looked at him with the direct intensity that had marked their first conversation on the bridge. "Mr. Whitmore, do you honestly believe that the value of a person is measured by their bank account?" "I've spent my whole life believing exactly that." "Then you've spent your whole life being wrong." Her voice carried gentle firmness. The stories my grandmother told weren't about rich people or successful people. They were about brave people, kind people, people who did the right thing when it was hard. Those are the stories worth passing down. Before Thomas could respond, Samuel entered from the kitchen, carrying 3 cups of Ruth's chamomile tea. Sounds like serious conversation in here. Mr. Whitmore's been telling me about his daughter, Eliza explained. She's expecting a baby. In the spring. Samuel settled into his chair, his face brightening with the genuine pleasure that marked all his responses to news of new life. Congratulations, Thomas. There's nothing quite like becoming a grandfather. Changes your whole perspective on what matters. I may never meet the child, Thomas said quietly. My daughter's new life doesn't include room for a father who lost everything. Have you asked her, or are you making that decision for her? Samuel's question carried the gentle challenge Thomas had learned to expect from this family, the refusal to let him settle for less than the truth. I assumed. Assumptions are dangerous things, Ruth said, appearing with her own cup of tea. They let us avoid difficult conversations by pretending we already know how they'll end. The 4 of them sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind moving around the corners of the house. Thomas found himself thinking about the courage it had taken for the Washington family to make room in their lives for a stranger, to risk their safety and reputation by offering shelter to someone they barely knew. I want to ask you something, he said finally, addressing all 3 of them. Why did you take me in? Really, I've been here for months now, and I still don't understand what made you willing to trust someone who had so clearly made a disaster of his life. The family exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them, before Samuel spoke. Thomas, when we first came to Millhaven, we were strangers too. Black family from the South, arriving in a town where most folks had never worked. Alongside people who looked like us, we faced suspicion, sometimes outright hostility. But gradually, Ruth continued, we found people who were willing to judge us by our actions rather than their assumptions. Mrs. Henderson at the store, Sheriff Reeves, the minister at the church, they gave us chances we hadn't earned yet, trusted us before we'd proven ourselves worthy of that trust. We learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is see them as they could become, rather than as they appear to be right now, Eliza added. You were broken when you came to us, but you weren't bad. Broken can be fixed if someone's willing to provide the tools and the time. Thomas felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the simple profundity of being truly seen, truly known, and still accepted. I don't deserve such grace. None of us do, Samuel replied. That's what makes it grace. The question is whether you can accept it and let it change you, or whether you're going to keep punishing yourself for mistakes that can't be undone. That night, lying in his narrow bed in the barn room, Thomas stared at the ceiling and contemplated the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been prepared to end his story on a bridge over Willow Creek. Now he found himself thinking not about endings, but about beginnings, not about what he had lost, but about what he might still be able to build for the first time in years. Tomorrow felt like a gift rather than a burden. The next morning brought news that would change everything again. Sheriff Reeves arrived just after breakfast, his expression mixing excitement with concern in ways that immediately put everyone on alert. Thomas, I've got a letter here from Austin that I think you need to see right away, he said, extending an official-looking envelope. Seems there's been some interesting developments regarding your old ranch. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he broke the official seal, aware that 3 pairs of eyes watched him with concern and curiosity. The letter was written on the letterhead of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law, Austin, Texas, a firm he had never heard of, but whose formal language immediately commanded attention. Dear Mr. Whitmore, he read aloud, his voice growing stronger as he processed the contents. We have been retained to locate you regarding a matter of significant financial import related to your former property, the Whitmore Ranch in Brazoria County, Texas. He paused, scanning ahead silently, his expression shifting from wariness to confusion to something approaching disbelief. Sheriff Reeves leaned forward in his chair, while the Washington family waited with the patient attention that marked all. Their responses to unexpected developments. "I don't understand," Thomas muttered, reading certain passages again. "This can't be right." "What does it say?" Eliza asked gently. Thomas cleared his throat and continued reading. "It has come to our attention that significant oil deposits have been discovered on the land formerly comprising your ranch. The Texas and Pacific Railroad, which acquired the property through foreclosure proceedings, has been approached by Standard Oil Company with an offer to purchase mineral rights for the sum of $800,000. The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the mantelpiece clock seemed unnaturally loud. Samuel was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. $800,000. "There's more," Thomas said, his eyes racing through the remaining paragraphs. "According to Texas law, mineral rights remain with the original owner unless specifically transferred in the deed of sale. Since the railroad acquired the property through foreclosure rather than purchase, and since the mineral rights were not explicitly addressed in the original mortgage documents, we believe you retain ownership of all subsurface deposits." Sheriff Reeves whistled low. "Thomas, do you understand what this means?" But Thomas was still reading, his face growing paler with each sentence. "The attorneys want to meet with me in Austin to discuss pursuing legal action to reclaim the mineral rights. They believe the case is strong enough to pursue on a contingency basis, meaning they won't charge fees unless they recover money on my behalf." Ruth moved to stand behind his chair, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Thomas, this could change everything." "I need air," Thomas said abruptly, standing so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "I need to think about this." Outside, he walked out to the barn, the others following at a respectful distance, their concern evident in the careful way they gave him space while remaining available if needed. Thomas leaned against the fence where his horse grazed, staring across the prairie without really seeing the landscape that had become so familiar. "It doesn't make sense," he said finally, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just shifted. "I lived on that land for 30 years. My father lived there before me. If there was oil, surely we would have known." "Not necessarily," Samuel said thoughtfully. "My brother worked in the Pennsylvania oil fields before coming west. He used to say that oil deposits could lie beneath land for generations without anyone knowing, especially in areas where people weren't looking for them. But $800,000, Thomas shook his head. "It's more money than I lost when the ranch was foreclosed, more money than I ever imagined having, even at the height of my success." Eliza approached slowly, her movements careful as if she were dealing with a spooked animal. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't seem happy about this news. Most people would be celebrating." Thomas looked at her with eyes that held a complexity of emotions she couldn't immediately pass. "Eliza, 6 months ago, I was ready to end my life because I thought I had lost everything that mattered. These past months, living here, working with your family, learning to find satisfaction in simple things, I thought I had finally discovered who I really was beneath all the wealth and status." "You have discovered that," she said firmly. "Have I? Or was I just playing at being humble because I had no other choice?" Thomas's voice carried the anguish of someone confronting uncomfortable possibilities about his own character. "Now that there's a chance to get money back, more money than I ever had before, I can feel something changing inside me already. I can feel the old Thomas Whitmore stirring to life, the one who measured everything by profit and loss." Sheriff Reeves stepped forward, his practical nature asserting itself. "Thomas, you're getting ahead of yourself. This letter doesn't guarantee anything except a conversation with some lawyers. There's no certainty you'll see a penny of this money." "But there's hope," Thomas replied, "and hope is dangerous. Hope makes you start planning for futures you might not get, wanting things you've learned to live without." Ruth moved to stand beside her daughter, her expression thoughtful. Thomas, money is just a tool. It's not good or bad by itself. It's what people do with it that matters. The question isn't whether you deserve this windfall or whether it will change you. The question is what kind of man you want to be if it comes to pass. What do you mean? I mean that if you do recover these mineral rights, if you do come into significant money, you'll have choices to make. You can go back to being the man you were before, focused on accumulation, impressed by your own success, measuring other people by their wealth. Or you can be the man you've become here, grateful for simple blessings, generous with what you have, understanding that true worth comes from how you treat people. Thomas stared at her, struck by the clarity of her insight. You think it's possible to have money and not be corrupted by it? I think it's possible for some people, Samuel said carefully. People who understand that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. People who remember what it felt like to have nothing, and who want to make sure others don't have to experience that same desperation. The real question, Eliza added, is whether you trust yourself to handle this opportunity with wisdom, and whether you trust us to help you stay grounded if you start to lose your way. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, watching his horse graze peacefully, thinking about the man he had been, and the man he had become, and the man he might yet choose to be. The oil money represented more than financial security. It represented a test of character more profound than losing everything had been. If this turns out to be real, he said finally, if I do recover significant money from these mineral rights, I want to make you all a promise. You don't owe us any promises, Samuel began, but Thomas held up his hand. I want to promise that I won't forget the lessons I've learned here, that I won't forget what it feels like to depend on other people's kindness, to earn my living with honest work, to measure success by whether I've made someone else's day a little brighter. He turned to face them directly, and I want to promise that whatever I receive, I'll share with the people who saved my life, not just my physical life, but my spiritual life as well. Thomas, Eliza began. No, let me say this. If I become wealthy again, I want to use that wealth the way you've used your poverty, to help people, to build community, to create opportunities for others to discover their own worth. I want to be the kind of rich man I never was before, one who understands that having much means owing much. Sheriff Reeves cleared his throat. That's a fine sentiment, Thomas, but first you need to decide whether you're going to Austin to meet with these lawyers. That's the immediate question. Thomas nodded slowly. I'll go. I'll hear what they have to say, explore whether their claims have merit, but I want to ask a favor. Anything, Ruth said immediately. I want Eliza to come with me. I trust her judgment, and I think I'll need someone there who can remind me who I really am if I start to get lost in dreams of wealth again. Eliza looked surprised. Mr. Whitmore, I've never been further from Millhaven than the county seat. I wouldn't know how to act in the big city, wouldn't know what questions to ask lawyers. You'll know how to ask the questions that matter, Thomas said with certainty. You'll know how to tell whether they're being honest, whether their plans serve justice or just profit. Most importantly, you'll know if I start to change into someone you can't respect. She met his gaze steadily, seeing in his eyes the same vulnerability she had recognized on the bridge months earlier, the look of a man who needed anchoring to something larger than his own desires and fears. All right, she said finally. If you think I can help, I'll come with you to Austin. As they made plans for the journey, none of them could have imagined how completely this unexpected opportunity would transform not just Thomas's future, but the future of everyone whose life had intersected with his on a bridge over Willow Creek on a morning when hope had seemed impossible. The train to Austin carried more than passengers. It transported hopes and fears that had been carefully packed alongside spare clothes, and Samuel's stern advice to remember who you are, no matter what you hear. Eliza sat by the window, her first journey beyond familiar horizons marked by a mixture of excitement and apprehension that she tried to hide behind careful attention to the changing landscape. Thomas found himself studying her profile as she watched the prairie give way to more settled country, noting the intelligence in her eyes as she absorbed new sights, the quiet dignity with which she handled the curious stares of other passengers who clearly wondered what connection existed between the weathered white man and the poised young black woman traveling together. "Nervous?" he asked quietly as the train pulled into a small depot to take on water. "Some," she admitted. "Not about the journey, but about whether I'll be any help to you when we meet with these lawyers. I've never dealt with people who measure conversations in hundreds of thousands of dollars." "I have," Thomas said grimly, "and it didn't serve me well the first time. Maybe someone who thinks in terms of human worth rather than monetary value is exactly what I need." The hotel in Austin that the law firm had recommended was modest but respectable, with a clerk who raised no objections to their separate accommodations once Thomas presented his letter of introduction from Hartwell, Morrison and Associates. Eliza's room was small but clean, with a window that looked out on the busy street below, and she spent an hour watching the flow of city life with the fascination of someone seeing a larger world for the first time. They met for dinner in the hotel restaurant, both dressed in their best clothes. Thomas in the one suit he had managed to keep when everything else was sold. Eliza in a dress her mother had helped her sew specifically for this occasion. The other diners paid them little attention, absorbed in their own concerns, allowing them to speak freely about the momentous conversation that awaited them. "What do you think I should ask them?" Thomas said, cutting his beef with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take good meals for granted. "I think you should ask them to explain everything in language that ordinary people can understand," Eliza replied. "When people start using complicated words and legal terms, sometimes it's because they don't want you to understand what they're really saying." "Good advice. What else?" "Ask them what happens if you lose the case. Ask them how long it might take. Ask them whether they really believe you have a chance of winning, or whether they're just hoping to make money from trying." She paused, considering. "And ask them what they think Standard Oil will do if you challenge their deal with the railroad." Thomas looked at her with growing respect. "You've been thinking about this seriously?" "I've been thinking about you seriously. About what this means for your future, for your peace of mind, for the man you've worked so hard to become." She met his eyes directly. "Mr. Whitmore, are you prepared for the possibility that you might become wealthy again?" The question struck him as both simple and profound. "I thought I was, but the closer we get to tomorrow's meeting, the more uncertain I become. Part of me wants this money, desperately. Not just for what it could buy, but for what it might prove about my worth. My vindication after months of feeling like a failure. And the other part is terrified that wealth will turn me back into the man I was before. Arrogant, disconnected from real people and real problems, measuring everything by profit and status." He set down his fork, his appetite diminished by the weight of introspection. "What if I can't handle prosperity any better the second time than I did the first? What if you can handle it better because you've learned things the first time around that you didn't know before?" Her question hung between them as they finished their meal and made their way back to their separate rooms. Thomas lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine futures that ranged from continued humble contentment to wealth beyond his previous experience. None of the possibilities felt entirely real, as if he were contemplating someone else's story rather than his own. Morning brought clarity of purpose, if not certainty of outcome. The offices of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates occupied 2 floors of a substantial building in the heart of Austin's business district, their success evident in the quality of furnishings and the efficiency of their staff. Thomas and Eliza were shown into a conference room where 3 men in expensive suits waited, with documents spread across a mahogany table that could have fed the Washington family for a month. "Mr. Whitmore," said the eldest of the three, rising to shake hands, "I'm Jonathan Hartwell. Thank you for making the journey to meet with us, and this must be Miss Eliza Washington," Thomas said firmly. "She's here as my advisor." If the lawyers were surprised by this arrangement, they were too professional to show it. Hartwell gestured toward chairs across from them, and Thomas noted with approval that Eliza was offered the same courtesy extended to him. "Let's begin with the essential facts," Hartwell said, opening a thick folder. "Standard Oil has approached the Texas and Pacific Railroad with an offer to purchase mineral rights to your former ranch for $800,000. The railroad believes they acquired these rights when they foreclosed on the property, but our research suggests otherwise." The younger lawyer, introduced as Morrison, spread out a series of documents. "Your original mortgage with Farmers and Merchants Bank contained standard language about the property serving as collateral, but it made no specific mention of mineral rights. Under Texas law, mineral rights remain with the landowner unless explicitly transferred. Which means," added the third lawyer, whose name was Patterson, "that when the railroad foreclosed, they acquired the surface rights, but not the subsurface rights. You still own everything beneath the soil." Thomas studied the documents carefully. Aware that Eliza was doing the same, her attention focused with the intensity he had learned to expect from her when something important was at stake. "What makes you so confident about this interpretation?" "Two things," Hartwell replied. "First, there's legal precedent. The Texas Supreme Court ruled in a similar case just last year that mineral rights don't transfer automatically unless the deed specifically includes them. Second, we've had a geologist review the railroad's claims about the oil deposits. If anything, they've underestimated the potential value, meaning that Standard Oil's $800,000 offer probably represents a fraction of what these mineral rights are actually worth. We estimate the true value could be as much as $2 million, possibly more." The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. $2 million represented wealth beyond anything he had imagined even during his most successful years as a rancher. It was enough money to buy a dozen ranches, to establish himself among the wealthiest men in Texas, to ensure comfort and security for generations. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice carefully steady. "We need you to sign a retainer agreement, authorizing us to file suit against both the railroad and Standard Oil to establish your ownership of the mineral rights. We'll work on contingency, no fees unless we recover money for you, but we'll take 30% of whatever we obtain." Eliza leaned forward slightly. "What are the risks? What happens if you lose the case?" Morrison answered her question with the respect he would have shown any advisor. "The primary risk is time. This type of litigation can take months or even years to resolve. There's also the possibility that the defendants will file countersuits, claiming damages for interference with their business arrangements." "And what do you think the railroad and Standard Oil will do when they receive your lawsuit?" she continued. "They'll fight it aggressively," Hartwell admitted. "They have significant resources and experienced legal teams. They'll challenge every aspect of our case, try to discredit our research, possibly even question Mr. Whitmore's standing to bring the suit." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same anxiety that had plagued him during the financial disaster that had cost him his ranch. "In other words, I'll be fighting the same kind of battle that destroyed me before, just from a different angle." "Not exactly," Patterson said. "Before, you were risking what you had on uncertain ventures. This time, you're fighting to recover what was already yours. The legal foundation is much stronger, but the stress would be similar," Eliza observed. "Months or years of uncertainty, waiting for other people to decide your fate, watching your hopes rise and fall with every development in the case." The lawyers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with advisors who understood the human cost of legal battles as well as their potential benefits. "That's true," Hartwell acknowledged. "Litigation of this magnitude is inherently stressful, but consider the alternative. walking away from what could be the largest oil discovery in Texas history. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below, where people went about their daily business, unaware that decisions were being made in rooms like this that could change lives completely. He thought about Samuel and Ruth, about their quiet contentment with modest means. He thought about Eliza, whose wisdom had grown from careful attention to life's simpler truths. He thought about the man he had become during months of honest work and genuine friendship. "Gentlemen," he said finally, turning back to face the lawyers, "I need some time to consider this decision. Can you give me until tomorrow morning?" "Of course," Hartwell replied. "This is a significant choice. You should consider it carefully." As they left the law offices, Thomas felt the weight of possibility pressing down on him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Eliza walked beside him in thoughtful silence until they reached a small park near their hotel, where she finally spoke. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that this decision will define not just my future, but who I really am," Thomas replied. "And I'm not sure I'm ready to find out the answer." That evening, Thomas and Eliza sat on a bench in the hotel's small garden, the noise of the city muted by distance and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. The decision before him felt larger than a simple choice about legal action. It represented a fundamental question about who he wanted to become and what kind of life would bring him genuine satisfaction. "Tell me what you're afraid of," Eliza said gently, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had stopped him on the bridge months earlier. Thomas was silent for several minutes, organizing thoughts that seemed to shift and change each time he tried to examine them closely. "I'm afraid that if I pursue this money, I'll become someone you can't respect, someone your family can't welcome at their table. And I'm afraid that if you don't pursue it, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been." Her response surprised him. "You think I should fight for the mineral rights? I think you should make whatever choice allows you to look at yourself in the mirror with peace," she replied. "But I also think you're making this decision more complicated than it needs to be." "How so?" "You're acting like money is inherently corrupting, like wealth automatically makes people selfish and cruel. But money is just a tool, Mr. Whitmore. The question isn't whether you should have it. The question is what you would do with it if you did." Thomas leaned back against the bench, watching the last light of evening fade from the sky. "When I was building the ranch, I told myself I was creating something important, something that would last beyond my lifetime. But somewhere along the way, the building became about proving my worth to other people, about accumulating enough success to feel secure in my own skin. And now I've learned that security doesn't come from what you own. It comes from knowing that people value you for who you are, not what you have. I've learned that the most satisfying work is often the simplest work, done for people who need it rather than people who can pay the most for it." Eliza nodded thoughtfully. "Those are important lessons. But why do you assume that having money would make you forget them? Because it did before. You're not the same man you were before. The Thomas Whitmore who lost his ranch was focused on accumulation and status. The Thomas Whitmore sitting here with me has spent months learning about service and humility and genuine friendship. Why? Would money change that?" Thomas turned to look at her directly, struck by the simple logic of her observation. "You really believe it's possible to be wealthy without being corrupted by wealth?" "I believe it's possible for you to be wealthy without being corrupted by it. Yes, because I've seen how you handle responsibility when you have it, how you treat people when you don't need anything from them, how you respond when others show you kindness." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The question isn't whether you deserve this money, Mr. Whitmore. The question is whether the world deserves to have someone like you control this much wealth." The insight hit him with the force of revelation. For months, he had been thinking about the mineral rights in terms of what they meant for his own future, his own security, his own redemption. But Eliza was asking him to consider something larger. what good he might do with resources that could change not just his life, but the lives of many others. "What would you do?" he asked. "If it were your decision to make." "I'd fight for it," she said without hesitation. "Not because I wanted to be rich, but because I'd want the chance to prove that wealth can be used for something better than just making more wealth. I'd want to show that someone who's been poor can handle prosperity with wisdom and generosity. And if the legal battle changes me, if the stress and uncertainty bring back the worst parts of who I used to be, then I'd trust the people who love you to pull you back to yourself, the same way we did when you were ready to give up entirely." Her voice carried quiet confidence. "Mr. Whitmore, you have something now that you never had during your first success. You have real friends, people who care about your character more than your bank account. That makes all the difference." Thomas felt something settling inside him, a sense of clarity that had been missing since Sheriff Reeves delivered the lawyer's letter. "You're right," he said slowly. "This isn't really about whether I should pursue the money. It's about whether I trust myself to use it well, and whether I trust you and your family to keep me accountable if I start to lose my way." "And do you?" "I do." He stood, sudden energy replacing the uncertainty that had plagued him for days. "Eliza, I want to fight for those mineral rights. Not because I need to be wealthy again, but because I want the chance to prove that someone can learn from their mistakes, that failure can teach lessons that success never could." She smiled, the first unreserved smile he had seen from her since they left Millhaven. "Then let's go back inside and prepare for tomorrow's meeting. You have lawyers to convince and a future to claim." As they walked back toward the hotel, Thomas felt the same mixture of fear and anticipation that had marked every significant decision in his life, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't facing the unknown alone. The morning meeting began precisely at 9 o'clock, with the same 3 lawyers arranged behind their mahogany table and the same stack of documents waiting for Thomas's signature. But something fundamental had changed overnight. Thomas carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had made peace with his decision and its consequences. "Gentlemen," he said without preamble, "I've decided to retain your services, to pursue recovery of my mineral rights. But I have some conditions that must be part of our agreement." Hartwell leaned forward with interest. "What conditions, Mr. Whitmore?" "First, I want complete transparency throughout this process. No decisions made without my knowledge, no settlements negotiated without my approval. If this case is going to consume months or years of my life, I want to understand every step of the journey." "That's reasonable," Morrison said, making notes. "What else?" "Second, I want regular updates on our legal strategy and our opponents' responses. If Standard Oil and the railroad are going to fight this aggressively, I want to know what weapons they're using and how we're defending against them." "Agreed," Patterson said. "Both reasonable requests. Is there anything else?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Eliza, drawing strength from her steady presence. "Yes, if we succeed in recovering significant money from these mineral rights, I want to establish a legal framework that ensures a substantial portion goes toward community development and educational opportunities." The lawyers looked puzzled. "Community development?" Hartwell asked. "I want to create a foundation that provides loans and grants to help working families buy land, start businesses, build schools in communities that lack them. I want to use whatever wealth we recover to create opportunities for people who might otherwise never have them." "Mr. Whitmore," Morrison said carefully, "we're talking about potentially millions of dollars. Are you certain you want to commit to giving away such a large percentage before you've even secured it?" "I'm certain," Thomas replied firmly. "I've learned that money has no value unless it's used for something meaningful. I want my wealth, if I obtain it, to reflect the lessons I've learned about what really matters in life." Eliza spoke for the first time that morning. Gentlemen, could you help Mr. Whitmore structure this foundation in a way that ensures the money is used effectively? He wants to make a difference, not just make himself feel better about being wealthy. Absolutely, Hartwell said, his professional demeanor warming to genuine enthusiasm. It's refreshing to work with someone who's thinking beyond personal enrichment. We can establish the foundation as part of our legal strategy, ensure everything is properly structured from the beginning. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the details of both the lawsuit and the charitable foundation. Thomas signed papers that committed him to a legal battle of uncertain duration and outcome, while simultaneously pledging to use any victory for purposes that extended far beyond his personal comfort. One final question, Thomas said as they prepared to conclude the meeting. How long before we know whether we have a real chance of success? Standard Oil and the railroad will have 30 days to respond to our initial filing, Hartwell explained. Their response will tell us a lot about how seriously they take our claims and how aggressively they plan to fight. If they offer to settle immediately, we'll know our case is strong. If they file countersuits and challenge every aspect of our legal theory, we'll know we're in for a lengthy battle. And if they ignore us entirely, then we'll know they don't consider us a serious threat, which could work in our favor when we present evidence to the court. As they left the lawyers' offices, Thomas felt the peculiar lightness that comes with making an irreversible decision. The anxiety and uncertainty that had plagued him for days had been replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his ranching days. "How do you feel?" Eliza asked as they walked back toward their hotel. "Terrified and exhilarated at the same time," Thomas admitted. "I've just committed to fighting some of the most powerful interests in Texas for money I may never see, and I've promised to give away most of it if I do recover it. 6 months ago, such a decision would have seemed like the height of foolishness. And now it feels like the most sensible thing I've ever done." He paused in front of the hotel, turning to face her directly. "Eliza, I want you to know that whatever happens with this lawsuit, whether we win or lose, you and your family have already given me something more valuable than money." "What's that?" "You've given me back my sense of purpose. For months after losing the ranch, I felt like my life had no meaning, like I was just taking up space in the world without contributing anything worthwhile. But watching your family, learning how you find joy in simple things and satisfaction in helping others, you've shown me that a life's value isn't measured by its accumulations. Mr. Whitmore, let me finish. If this lawsuit succeeds, if I do recover significant wealth, I want you to help me manage the foundation we discussed. I want you to help me ensure that the money goes to people who will use it wisely, communities that will benefit from investment, families who just need a chance to prove what they're capable of achieving." Eliza stared at him, overwhelmed by the unexpected offer. "I don't know anything about managing large sums of money or running foundations. You know everything that matters," Thomas said firmly. "You know how to recognize genuine need, how to distinguish between people who deserve help and people who just want easy money, how to measure success by its impact on human lives rather than its return on investment. Those are the skills that matter most for what I have in mind." As they prepared to return to Millhaven, both of them understood that their lives had been permanently altered by decisions made in a lawyer's conference room in Austin. The legal battle ahead would test Thomas's resolve and character in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since losing his ranch, he faced uncertainty with hope rather than despair. 2 years later, Thomas Whitmore stood on the same bridge where Eliza Washington had saved his life, watching the morning sun paint the prairie in shades of gold that reminded him why he had once fallen in love with this harsh, beautiful land. The legal battle had ended 6 months earlier with complete victory, the mineral rights restored to his ownership, the oil extraction contracts renegotiated on terms that would provide income for generations, and the foundation established with enough funding to transform communities across 3 states. But it was the smaller victories that brought him the deepest satisfaction. The school that now stood on the east side of Millhaven had been the Foundation's first major project, providing education for children whose families had previously been unable to afford such opportunities. Eliza served as its principal, her natural wisdom and gentle authority making her beloved by students and parents alike. The sight of her moving among the children, guiding their studies with the same patience she had once shown him, never failed to move him profoundly. "Thinking deep thoughts again?" Ruth Washington's voice interrupted his reverie as she approached with a basket of fresh bread for the church social that would begin within the hour. "Thinking grateful thoughts," Thomas corrected, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the town center. "2 years ago, I stood on this bridge ready to end my story. Now I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else in the world." Ruth smiled, her face showing the contentment that came from watching her daughter flourish in ways she had always believed possible. "Eliza says you received another letter from your daughter yesterday." "I did." Thomas's expression brightened. "Sarah wants to bring her little boy for a visit this summer. She says she's curious to meet the man who's been sending such thoughtful gifts and letters, and she wants her son to know his grandfather." "That must make your heart glad, gladder than I can express. For the longest time I thought I had nothing to offer a grandchild except regrets and cautionary tales. Now I realize I have something much more valuable. I have wisdom earned through failure, compassion learned through loss, and the example of people like your family who showed me what real wealth looks like." They had reached the town square, where the monthly community gathering was already taking shape. The Washington Foundation, as the townspeople had insisted on calling it despite Thomas's protests, had funded not just the school but also improvements to the church, the library, and the medical clinic. More importantly, it had provided low-interest loans that allowed families to buy small farms, start businesses, and build the kind of economic security that created genuine community prosperity. Thomas watched Samuel directing the setup of tables and chairs with the quiet authority that had made him a natural choice for the town council, and saw Eliza emerge from the schoolhouse with a group of her older students who would be helping serve the meal. The sight of her still caused his heart to skip slightly, not with romantic yearning, for their relationship had evolved into something deeper and more enduring than romance, but with gratitude for the wisdom she had brought to his life and the partnership they had forged in managing the Foundation's work. "Mr. Whitmore!" a young voice called from across the square, and Thomas turned to see Bobby Henderson running toward him with the enthusiasm that marked all of the boys' interactions. Bobby's father had used a foundation loan to expand the general store, and the family's improved circumstances had allowed Bobby to continue his education rather than leaving school to work. "Hello, Bobby. How are your studies progressing?" "Miss Eliza says I'm ready to start learning algebra next term," Bobby said proudly. "And Papa says if I keep working hard, maybe I can go to the university in Manhattan when I'm older." "I'm sure you can, if that's what you want," Thomas replied, remembering his own lack of formal education and the opportunities he might have had if circumstances had been different. Education is the one investment that always pays dividends. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself moving through the crowd of neighbors and friends, checking on the progress of various Foundation projects, listening to concerns and suggestions, but mostly just enjoying the particular satisfaction that comes from being useful to people you care about. The wealth he had recovered from the oil rights had indeed transformed his life, but not in the ways he might have expected 2 years earlier. Rather than returning him to his former status as a cattle baron, the money had given him something more valuable, the opportunity to be genuinely helpful to his community, to create lasting improvements that would benefit people long after he was gone. He had learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy, between having money and having purpose. As evening approached and the social began to wind down, Thomas found himself once again on the bridge with Eliza, both of them helping to clean up while enjoying the peaceful transition from day to night. "Any regrets?" she asked, the question that had become a sort of ritual between them whenever they found themselves reflecting on the path that had brought them to this point. "Only one," Thomas said, leaning against the railing where she had once found him, preparing to give up on tomorrow. "I regret that it took losing everything to teach me what everything really meant. I regret the years I spent accumulating things instead of building relationships, measuring success by what I owned rather than what I contributed. But if you hadn't learned those lessons the hard way, would you be the man you are now?" Thomas considered this carefully as he considered all of Eliza's questions. Probably not. The Thomas Whitmore who never failed, never would have understood the value of genuine friendship, never would have recognized that the poorest people often possess the richest wisdom, never would have learned that the most satisfying work is often the humblest work. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, listening to the gentle sound of water moving over stones, the same sounds that had provided the backdrop to their first conversation. "Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can save more than one life," Thomas said softly, echoing the words that had brought them together. "You saved mine that morning, Eliza, but you also saved everyone whose life has been touched by what we've built together since then." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "You gave me the chance to discover capabilities I never knew I possessed, opportunities I never could have imagined. The foundation work, the school, the chance to make a real difference in people's lives. None of that would have been possible without your willingness to trust my judgment." As they walked back toward town, Thomas reflected on the truth that had gradually emerged from the ruins of his former life. Genuine prosperity had nothing to do with the size of one's bank account and everything to do with the depth of one's connections to other people, the meaningfulness of one's daily work, and the legacy one left for future generations. The bridge behind them stood exactly as it had 2 years earlier, weathered but sturdy, bearing the weight of dreams and daily necessity. But for Thomas Whitmore and Eliza Washington, it would forever represent something more. The place where despair had been transformed into hope, where ending had become beginning, where two lives had intersected in ways that created ripples of positive change, extending far beyond what either of them could have imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve their community, new chances to prove that wealth handled with wisdom could indeed make the world a better place. But tonight, walking home together under a canopy of prairie stars, they carried with them the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and lives well lived. Sometimes the greatest riches are discovered not in what we accumulate, but in what we choose to give away.